Christmas Eve, 8-minute sermon.
13. Not my fault you were eating chicken wings in the back.
I
interrupted.
My hands were coated in wing
Lunchtime
sauce.
for you.
Wait a minute,
I was
what? Yeah,
eating
this is
chicken
Christmas
wings.
Eve?
Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
You're backstage.
Just so the people know, while I'm out sweating and preaching, the band is backstage slugging food.
I thought I had 20 minutes. So I'm just inhaling a plate of chicken wings. And Nate runs back and he's like, he's praying. And I was like, ha ha. No, I still felt like I had chicken in my teeth. Like I was like, there has to be like sauce like on my face or something.
Our goal on this podcast is to know Jesus better and by the power of his Spirit do better so together we can be a little better. Well, hello and welcome to A Little Better. So glad to have you here for week one of a brand new series on the book of Ruth. Drew, great to have you back. I hope you enjoyed your time away. We're thrilled to have you. Did a great job kicking off this series. We've got Brittany McCracken here in the studio as well. First timer. Really looking forward to hearing from her. But first, let's get people caught up. Sermon in 60.
All right, well, we started the book of Ruth. We looked at chapter 1 and really the hardship and pain that Naomi and Ruth had to walk through. We see Ruth's commitment to her mother-in-law, putting her life on hold to really be a good friend to her. And so we talked a little bit about friendship, what a good friend is, and how we can navigate hurt or help someone who is hurting. And we gave pieces of advice for both categories that we see from Ruth and Naomi.
Mm-hmm. So, Britt, I'll give you time to think about this question while I ask Drew what he left on the table. 25 minutes flies by so fast. So usually there's other things that, could have been squeezed in. So, Britt, I'll ask you, too, what you wished he'd addressed. But, Drew, do you leave anything on the table, or do you get it all out there, everything that could be said about Ruth and Naomi?
Yeah, I don't know if I could ever say it. Yeah, I got everything out on the table. There is a timer, no matter, what you're talking about. And so I think the biggest thing is, obviously, you're covering a chapter of a story, and so we didn't get to cover all the text, see some of the nuances and the details of the text. So we tried to hit the major points of each moment in their beginning of their story. So I would say I would have loved to have been able to just kind of walk a little more detailed through chapter 1 and hit some of the highlights that we missed. That would be probably one of the areas that I think I left it.
Visiting scholar Brittany McCracken's willing to fill those in for us.
No, I'm not a scholar.
Me neither, so congratulations.
I don't think I feel like it was a great sermon, and I took away a lot from it. I think like one of the challenging parts when you're talking about suffering is talking about redemption and like, what does that realistically look like? And it's not going to look like what you necessarily want. Your outcome is not going to look like what you imagine the best outcome to be. So like, how do we still find some joy in the suffering and not knowing when it's going to end? You might be in chapter 1, but also you might be in chapter 1 for like a long time. And yeah, I think it's a tough topic because like, look at John the Baptist, look at Jesus and like people waiting for breakthrough, and they didn't have a happy ending, yet it was like the breakthrough we needed. Yeah. I don't know if that's total derailment off of the
I think
topic.
that's why I like this sermon is we didn't get to the breakthrough, right? So we're not rushing, it's hard to talk about suffering and like just leave it at suffering. Yeah. But that's life. You know what I mean? That is like, we all want breakthrough, but breakthrough, who knows? This might be only chapter 1. Naomi had 4 chapters. We might have 12. We might have, we're not promised.
2.
And the redemption, we don't know what it will look like. So I think that's one of the things I like about the start of Ruth is we're going to start in the lament. We're going to start in the suffering because that is a beautiful picture of, it's not a beautiful picture, it's an ugly picture of what our lives often look like. Yeah.
No, I think it's a good point where we have to remember the characters in the story don't know how it's going to turn out either. Right. But we read it and we see, oh, here's that story, and it's like, oh, that's what's going to happen to me. Well, they didn't know what was going to happen to them. You don't know what's going to happen to us. We don't know what's going to happen to us, but we can all, there are certain things we can have confidence about, right? That God will finish what he started.
Yep.
So it's
Yeah.
we don't know what the ending's going to look like, how we're going to get there, but it's
Well, and it takes us 4 weeks to go through 4 chapters that
Mm-hmm.
represent not 4 weeks in life. You know what I mean? I think that's the hard part about the Bible is you read the story and it finishes so fast because you read the 4 pages and you're like, wow, this story's already over. But that's someone's life. Right. That's, next week we'll talk about them threshing wheat in the field, picking up scraps. Like the Bible doesn't say, oh, and they did that for 40 days and this
Right.
could have been a extended period of just
Sure.
hardship and time. We don't know.
Right. And like it's been 10 years that they're in wherever they are. You can tell me. Moab. And like she doesn't have any kids. Ruth doesn't have any kids at the
No.
end of that. And that's just like one verse. It's like after 10 years, the 2 husbands die.
Oh, yeah.
So like there's probably
Yeah.
so much like hurt and pain that's already been going on in that story that's just kind of blown over
even
as
mentioned.
well. It's just one verse.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. I'm going to throw a crazy curveball Brit's way.
Curveball. Okay.
Perfect.
Which
Yay.
is no, I love. So Rochester, Britt is our Rochester Worship Director, which really means she's also our online worship director because our online
yeah.
services, all those people, they're watching the Rochester stage. So I just feel like the band is crushing it. You guys are doing a
Thanks.
great job. I love the way you change it up. You bring choirs up, different things, stepping back, letting other people. One question I appreciate all that. One question I had is, do you try to connect in the sermon in any way? Is it totally out of your hands? Does your brother, because your brother is, what's
Right.
his title?
I don't know, executive worship, something.
Executive director of worship
Grand
and creative.
poobah of worship. But is he making the choices for songs, not you?
We all come together as worship directors and plan services, so they're the same for every campus.
I see.
Generally, there's a little bit of wiggle room.
And I imagine, tell me how it works in terms of connecting to the preaching calendar.
We do look at the preaching calendar. Usually, like the songs before won't necessarily have anything to do with the message. But if we do a song after, we look at sermon notes. What's our takeaway? Do we want to have a prayer moment at the end? And how can we like connect it to a song at the end?
Yeah.
So usually the song at the end will have more of a connect to what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, what you're doing, I don't know how it all works.
It's
behind
not
the
me,
scenes.
it's everyone.
Oh, that's good.
Everyone
that's good
picks
to
the
know.
songs.
But I'm glad to know that you have a voice in it, and that it's a team collaborative effort. Because what you guys put together, I think you've been crushing it
Yeah.
for the last few weeks.
Thank you.
So you basically structured this message between Naomi and Ruth,
Yep.
and letting us identify with one or the other. So we'll start with Naomi, which is really the dark part of the tale. And one thing I was thinking about, Britt, is just like, is there room in our worship for more? I mean,
Lament.
the mood isn't always the same, right? It's not all rah-rah celebration. And to me, this isn't a rah-rah celebration story with Naomi. And I loved kind of leaning into just how much Naomi was hurting. But yeah, I'll let you. Any comments there on
As
how
far
bad
as
she's
like
hurting?
worship and
Yeah, just worship. Tell me. Do you think about?
suffering?
I mean, what do you think about? What are the different moods in worship? Is it high? Is it low? Is it fast? Slow? Is it reflecting? Is it
all of those things.
Yeah. Try to mix that in.
Well, I think like there's a misconception that like worship is always out of like happiness and joy. I think we find our joy in Christ, and you can worship through suffering. Yeah. I don't know. That's tough. I think even our upbeat songs, man, one time my mom was like in a front seat during a really upbeat song. We're like talking about being made alive in Christ, and she's down there crying. So then I'm crying during like the most upbeat song. But yeah, I think there's some room for lament, but I think as far as like worship and the gathering of believers to worship, it's thanking God still for what he's done despite our circumstances and what he's going to do through our circumstances and our suffering, and knowing that he is working everything out for our good, and that we can find joy in.
Yep.
Right.
No matter what you're going through.
Yeah, I think you guys do a great job of that, of picking songs that like openly admit the hardship and the pain. You know, the wind may come, the rain may blow, right? Like that's hardship, but it's you I hold on to. So like the one thing that I love about songs and lyrics is you can admit the struggle, but they always point you to the hope. They always, because no matter what we face, in every song, we can be reminded of, like Britt said, of Jesus. And there's hope in Jesus no matter what you face and what pain you're dealing with. That's the hope we cling to. And so I think of Man of Sorrows, right, is another song of like hardship, but then hope of Jesus. And so, you know, there's all kinds of songs. There's some upbeat songs that you just want to dance and like, you know, Gone. I think that's one of them. What's the song? I came out of that grave, or sorry. This is why I preach and not sing, guys.
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue too. But you even quoted and the story.
Father's House.
Father's House.
What's
the story
line?
isn't over if the story isn't
good.
good.
Thank you. But that's it. And then, but you did.
But that's an upbeat song.
It is.
But last week you did. Is it Son of Suffering? What's it called?
Yeah, we did Son of Suffering.
Son of Suffering, is that the title? Okay, but it has that line in it, there's a God who weeps, there's a God who bleeds. And that always breaks me every time we sing that. But that's...
Well, I mean, like, we did Praise You Anywhere last week, too. It's like, sometimes you have to dance through the darkness, in the lion's den.
Yeah.
Like, and if you look at examples of worship in the Bible, too, like, was it Paul and Silas in the prison?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they can be freed, but they're in there worshiping in their imprisonment.
Right.
Like that's
not knowing they would be free. Too,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to connect this to Naomi.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talk about Naomi, and one thing I loved, Drew, was letting Naomi be honest with God, letting Naomi just express how dark and hard her circumstance was. And you connect it to some of the, the Psalms have that mood too. Here's what I was thinking was like, aren't we supposed to, don't we call that spiraling? You know, when someone is just like focusing on that and just getting worse and worse. Aren't we supposed to break the spiral? Aren't we supposed to tell them to have an attitude of gratitude, work on their gratitude journal, and just, I mean, isn't that the kind of counsel we offer people in those circumstances?
No, I don't think that is. I think there is a season where people do spiral and we need to snap them out of it. But people need time to process, to reflect, to at some level even call it what you want, vent to God. Like if you think of we're always like, I need a safe place to vent. Well, usually people aren't that. God is. Because you're not going to change God's opinion. You're not going to convince him to come to your side to complain. And so the safest place to vent is to your Heavenly Father, because your venting won't impact him.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we choose to vent to other people, which is probably not the best choice. God is a great place. But I think we should be allowed to process, to openly be like, this sucks. This is hard. I don't like this God. I don't want this God. And I think there's a season for that. Now, I think if you continue to do that, you need friends in your life to be like, okay, you're digging yourself too deep of a hole, and I'm going to pull you out of it, right? There is time for wise counsel for people to say, you're spiraling now. Like, you've been venting long enough. It's time to see the truth. But I think, here is this woman who's lost her husband and her sons. Like that takes time to just even process of what your life looks like and navigate the pain.
Yeah.
Right. And like in their society, that the loss of security. Like she didn't just lose her husband and companion and her sons. That's my worst fear, is losing my kids. But it's like losing any stability she had in their society.
Yeah. Incredible. And we'll never tell you to snap out of it, Britt. I mean, at the wrong time.
At the wrong time? Yeah. Well, we'll just get into it, I guess. I'm on my second marriage, my current husband. But in my first marriage, it was very tumultuous And I think a lot of the advice I got was just like, well, marriage is for your holiness and not your happiness. And it felt like a lot of people don't want you to feel what you're feeling and be in your mourning. Like, yes, marriage is for your holiness. And like, it can be good advice, but to me, it just felt like, sometimes it feels like you're screaming on deaf ears where no one hears your pain. Like, obviously, God is there. He hears you. But to have someone to be able to, like, bear that burden with you and say, yeah, that's really hard.
Yeah.
That I feel like is important. And that gives people time to mourn. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's several proverbs, almost about proverbs, that just say that, the wise man, the wise woman knows what to say, when to say. And there are true things that can be said at the wrong time and in the wrong way, but having a sensitivity about that. But
Well, that's what I love about Ruth, too. It doesn't seem like Ruth is trying to make things better for Naomi or saying, hey, it's going to be okay. She's just saying, I'm here. I see your pain and I'm with you, right? You will be, I'm going to be with you. Your people are going to be my people. Your God, I'm just committed to you.
Yeah.
She's not trying to like downplay her hurt or her pain. She's not like, get over it. We got to make this. We got to figure it out. So she's like, I'm here for you. And for me, at least in all my moments of pain, having people there, right? I didn't need them to be like, I'm so sorry. This is horrible. I just needed them to hug me, to hold me, to be present with me, to know when I needed something, I knew who to go to. And I feel like that is the beauty of Ruth in this story for her mother-in-law, who had no security, stability. Ruth was that for her.
Yeah. And Ruth is going through her own loss of her husband.
Yeah, Ruth is interesting because she is suffering so much herself and yet being a helper.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, later in the story, we're going to find someone step into the story with more resources, but Ruth doesn't have resources. Ruth steps in as a woman, as a widowed woman. So she's a foreigner, right?
Yeah.
She's, doesn't share Naomi's faith, probably maybe even language. I'm not enough of a scholar to know if these were different languages and how big the cultural difference was. But she's a refugee. They're refugees. I mean, it's just you think about someone with the least voice, least power. And yet was the most amazing friend. To her, and I'll let you guys think about it because I know I'm blindsiding you with this one. But if it occurs to you, just bring back any stories of people who'd been Ruth to us, or to you. Were there people who stepped in your, in your hard times, and were
Yes.
You
This
got one
message
already.
actually brought me into like a lot of reflection and just times where I've been a Naomi or a Ruth or an Orpah. Is it Orpah?
Yeah.
I keep wanting to say Oprah, but
It's fine.
yeah. So at the end of my not the end of my divorce, going through my divorce, kind of makes you feel like untouchable, abandoned. I remember at one point telling someone like, I don't have a future in the church. Like church is great, but I'll never be able to be a part of that. Wow, I can't believe I'm crying on this podcast. But I felt like my friend Britt Catlin, she works here. She's our communications director. She just was my friend that would show up for me. And I didn't even have to talk to her. She just would sit there and let me cry. Super uncomfortable. I hated it. But it felt really healing that someone was just there for me, not trying to fix my circumstances, but just showing up in love for me through a difficult time and being there for me. So she's my Ruth.
Oh.
What's crazy is like knowing your story, I feel like you and Ruth have a lot in common. And, like the journey that you've been on and like the friendships that you experience. And I think even of your husband now, like just the whole, whole ties and connections and seeing how God has redeemed your story and where you are now is pretty, like, it's kind of like a mirror.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously different circumstances, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, thanks so much for sharing, that so transparently. And it happens, to me too. Sometimes you start talking about something and you're just surprised by what it touches and what it reminds you of. But I think a lot of people like listening to this podcast, listening to this sermon, and we talked before in preparing these messages, there really are no villains in the book of Ruth. It's really life that just happens to people. There's no villains. But a lot of us, they might not have, husbands that died young, but many have had, husbands who've left, or dads who've left, or people who've disappointed, or the rest, in other ways. So I think your experience, Britt, a lot of people, will identify with. Yeah. But I also appreciate, and I hadn't really thought about it, but the way people, the shame and the unworthiness, right? That the lies, that we hear, and the ways, Satan gets a bit of a foothold in there and saying, God can't redeem this. That's right. It's over. So
that's the beauty of Ruth is I'm sure that's what Naomi felt. Mm-hmm. God can't redeem this. Yeah. Right. And it took time, but it's like what Paul says, right? We need to know as Christians that God can redeem anything and everything. Yeah. Right. He works all things for our good. Yeah. And our good isn't his good and our good. The problem is there's a disconnect there, right? That we need to bridge that gap of like we want God's good more than our good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I don't know why I'm going to just keep talking about my divorce, but I had a moment where I had come to church going through it, and we were singing the Resurrecting. What's that song? Resurrecting King. And there's that line, the resurrecting King is resurrecting me. By your spirit I will rise. You're like claiming victory.
Pretty upbeat song.
And I remember just sitting there bawling my eyes out, realizing that my victory was never going to be like the healing of my marriage, but that my victory was that Jesus was like changing my heart and like really softening me. Mm-hmm. And so I think like in our pain and in our suffering, realizing that our outcome is not going to be this pretty wrapped up bow, even though it ends up being that for Ruth and Naomi, but that God's after our heart, and we can find joy in that. It's not going to be the way that we want it, but he's made us better, and he's changed us for the better, and we can find joy in any circumstance. Mm-hmm. And we can even claim that victory knowing it's going to be coming, and it hasn't come yet. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, Drew, I don't know of a better way to end the podcast than that. Brett, thanks so much. I mean, what you came through is blessing other people, and all credit to a God who redeems. So, and is resurrecting you, resurrecting me, resurrecting all of us. Well, listen, that's only week one. And there's so much more to the story. And where it's going to point us is going to be amazing. So please keep coming back. Thanks for joining us. Come on back next week for Chapter 2, Week 2, Part 2 of Ruth.